So we can start. It's been some minutes, and it's good to see all of you here. Welcome to this seminar. It's arranged by the department's strategic platform for sustainable development, the Long View. So that's me, Karin, and Olof and Roland. We're in the core group. And this seminar is a part of Longview's aim to work towards joint learning at the department. We are convinced that engineers and designers have an important role to play for sustainable development. Stefan Anderberg here has since 2013 been a professor in industrial ecology at Linköping University. He has a PhD in human geography here at Lund University. He was previously the co-director of Luxus, also here in Lund, between 2007 and 2013, associate professor at the University of Copenhagen and researcher at the IIASA. So that's the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis in Austria. He's a member of Pharma's evaluation panel 4 in resource efficient products and processes, and was formerly a member of the Educational Science Committee of the Swedish Research Council. His research has been related to various sustainability challenges and often focused on the development of resource flows in different scales, their impact and related governance issues, different methods of evaluating resource flows, how cities, regions, companies respond to sustainability and climate challenges. His current research focuses on resource-efficient regional and urban development, urban metabolism, industrial symbiosis in ports, bioenergy development, international urban climate cooperation, and the management of electronic waste in developing countries. So this presentation, Sustainability Challenges for Product Development, will address the challenges posed by the accelerating global increase of consumption, and particularly focus on the difficulties to evaluate the impacts along the whole product life cycle. So welcome, Stefan.
Thank you.
The floor is yours.
Thank you. I can immediately skip my first slide. This is what I would like to address. I'm going to start off by a frame of the development of material flows and come into various challenges in connection to that. The challenge to change the impact along the whole life cycle, and then further challenges for sustainable design, and particularly the challenge of evaluating, measuring, and comparing impacts. And I have also thrown in a section on the circular economy. That is the new trendy concept that this winter has had a remarkable breakthrough in the EU with the launching of the EU Circular Economy Action Plan. Well, the starting point is that our consumption of products and production processes has consequences. Well, sometimes we know something about the consequences. We have a more or less detailed view of different production systems. But in most cases, we have only fragments, and we are not able to evaluate the full consequences. We know that part of the consequences, well, should not be there. This is the recycling of e-waste in Pakistan. And if the regulations had really worked, none of this would happen. But there are stronger forces in play than regulation, it's a remarkably profitable business for everyone involved, with possible exception of the health of the workers that normally are quite unaware but happy to have a livelihood. So we have difficulties both to overview, evaluate and mitigate effects that we might not be fully aware of. But the starting point for my talk is actually that, well, some of these challenges, they can be handled by, well, new and innovative design of products, of production systems, and partly by waste handling systems. And this may make a difference. If it will be enough or not, that's for later discussion. Well, this is the classic introduction of the industrial metabolism perspective, showing the difference between the consumption by modern man. In this case, it's a modern Swiss, because the study is based on Brunner's studies of Switzerland, and comparing that with a Stone Age man. And the most striking differences is what goes off to air. The difference is essentially the consumption of fossil fuels. Most of what flows through is connected to water. And another striking difference is the amount of solid waste, 3 tons per capita and year, and the accumulation in society of 260 tons per year. Accumulation in society, what is that? What stays in society? It's, of course, you could say, stable structures that are used over a long time, basically buildings and infrastructures, roads, and all our resource supply networks of various kinds. This development, or at least the later parts of it, can also be described as the growing inflows into the world economy. These are the most important, you could say, resource raw materials that flow into society. And for metals, it's of course only mining production. The very large recycled metal stream is not included. That is dominating for. When we look at commercial products, to summarize this, we can say that on the average, every man or woman on Earth is responsible for consuming 2 tons of fossil fuels and 2 tons of building materials. Per year. That's the average. I think that we are Well, it's very few of us that are close to that. And then we live in also a system that has developed and changed quite a lot because, one of the tons of building materials are consumed only in China. So half the building activity in the last few years have been in China. This is, you could say, the standard model for the flows through society. Well, as you know it's the kind of linear model from extraction in mining over refining, it's to product manufacturing, product use, and product disposal. This particular illustration, it's from a study I was involved in the 90s. And this particular flow diagram, it focuses on the two most important sources of cadmium in urban areas. And it's via two kinds of products. It's car tires and it's galvanized materials on buildings. And particularly when the level of acidic compounds was quite high in European cities, the runoff from buildings were quite enormous in areas like the Ruhr area. So, but these streams are still there, but they have decreased over time, particularly because also that cadmium is contamination connected to zinc that is used, for example, for stabilizing car tires, but the level of cadmium has decreased. So these streams were more visible in the 60s, actually. Then you can also say that the last step, the product disposal, it depends, well, the further environmental impact, it depends very much on how products, here the tires, are disposed of after consumption. Do you know where most tires go after consumption in Europe? They go to factories or waste incineration plants for incineration. One of the largest users of car tires in Europe has been cement manufacturing. And that's why cement plants also have had large heavy metal emissions. If you look at the development of resource flows in society, you can generalize, well, it's not hard to say that they have become larger, they have become longer. In earlier societies, most of what we consumed originated from our close surroundings. But now, more and more of what we consume is produced or originate far away. The flows have become more open and they contain many more elements. They are more complex. And particularly with the chemical revolution, our consumption contains thousands of chemical compounds. It's actually hard to say how many. Do you know how many? About?
I think we know about 100,000 or something. Right?
Yeah, the 100,000, that's what has been used commercially in the EU. 107,000 was the answer some 15 years ago. But it's probably something in the 10,000, between 10 and 50,000. And most of these compounds, they are not used everywhere because they are only used in connection with production. So in the EU, if you say that it's between 40 and 50,000, all these compounds are probably used in Germany, but not in other states, because Germany has a particular role in the chemical production. Then they are also much more complex in terms of how they are. What's a good word? Sammansatta. Compiled, yeah. And then you can't actually say that all flows have become faster, because many large flows have actually become slower. Do you know a flow that has become much slower than it was 100 years ago?
Food, for example.
Food, yes. Because, and this is an illustration, 100 years ago all food had to be eaten fresh. Now it can take weeks and months before it's consumed. And that also makes it possible to separate the production and the consumption. And this is from a study that now is fairly old, but it shows the development from a traditional system where you consumed very fresh milk. It took, maybe some 24, 30 hours between the farm and the table in the home. While in the beginning of the 80s, it was almost up to 6 days. And in this development lies also the concentration of dairy manufacturing that has just continued. I think that in that illustration, the total distance was only a few kilometers, while in the latter it was tens of kilometers, even if it was in a densely populated part in Europe. And the trade and the traded part of our resource flows has continued to grow, and what has changed a lot in recent years is the growth that involved developing countries. The relations in trade have changed quite dramatically in the last 40 years. Before 1970, you had a system that was dominated by manufacturing in northern countries, and the developing world, or the South, mostly contributed via raw materials. In the current system, the developing world has become more and more important in terms of manufacturing, while more and more of the raw materials are produced in northern peripheral countries, such as Russia, Australia, Canada, the US, and South Africa, and some countries in Latin America. There is a risk, or maybe by necessity, the resource flows that I showed was going up, and maybe even more dramatically in the last decade, they will continue to grow. Because we are right now in the perhaps most dramatic development of wealth in the world that the world ever has witnessed. In 2030, it's estimated, well, I have even things higher figures, that 4.8 billion people will belong to the world's middle class. And the world's middle class, that's people that can at least consume and travel on the level of the average Swede. So that's what we are facing. And no matter if you believe in resource scarcity or in, immediate climate change threats, anyone can understand that carrying this, it will be an enormous stress on our resources of various kinds. Everything, all exploitation of the world might explode beyond any control. Well, which are then the problems? More or less immediate. Of course, it's depletion of non-renewable resources. It's over-exploitation of renewable resources of various kinds. Not all parts of the world have anything that can be called, well, sustainable land management. And few have some sustainable forestry, for example, that we often boast about. Then there are the pollution and other health and environmental impacts in connection with all these different steps in the material flows. And we have the threats that are particularly connected to the use of fossil fuels that drive the whole system still. And one should also emphasize that many development trends, such as globalization, specialization, diversification of industry, and the increasing complexity of products, make it more difficult to introduce a more circular economy via recycling. Well, I guess that you have seen this enough. I like this illustration because the green part, it shows what is connected to the exploitation of landscapes. what is released in connection with enlargement of the agricultural activities and cutting down forests, etc. And you can say that that part of the emissions, it has moved around the world. Everywhere it reaches its maximum in connection with, well, what we could call an industrialization takeoff. So if we go back 100 years, then Sweden played a major role for such emissions. But now we are rather a plus country that, well, at least not contribute with, well, cutting down forests that we not replant, and we don't expand our agriculture on peat soils anymore, etc. We rather decrease our agriculture. Since the 70s, the problem perception has changed. We have the new dominant problem of climate change that had not been even discovered in the beginning of the 70s. Instead, it was the resource crisis, the population explosion that were the dominant themes. And we have still a kind of resource crisis, but it's not considered very immediate. It's mostly relative. We can find single materials with very limited reserves, but it's not really for tomorrow. And in most cases, the reserves, and you need to emphasize that a reserve is something that is known and exploitable at the current price levels. So it's not an absolute concept. They are generally much larger today than they were in the 1970s, with few exceptions. One of the most obvious cases where we have a depletion is petroleum, oil. But in the 70s, we had 10 to 15 years of reserves. Now we have some 40 years. Instead, it's health and environmental deterioration along the whole life cycle and climate change that are the priority. And how then to reduce the impacts of a dramatically growing consumption? Well, the challenges to change consumption impact, if I may, is of course that our society is dominated by linear flows, where products, processes, supply chains, and business models have been created without much consideration of environmental costs of any kind, or human costs. It's quite recent where we only in, you could say, very few cases can connect well-known trademarks to exploitation of children or cheap labor in some developing countries. And we have only partial overviews of the consequences of our choice of consumption and various products. Then we can also say that redesigning products and process production systems and supply chains in various kinds, it's much more powerful tools than changing consumer behavior. Even if we have sometimes been led to believe that the choices that consumers make are the one decisive point. Well, there are still some choices that consumers can make that would make a difference, at least in the long run. If 500,000 Swedes don't go to Thailand, it might make a difference. As a response to this, we have, as you are much more aware of than I am, a development of a whole scene of sustainable design schools. These schools are most often characterized by life cycle perspectives and thinking. They have a circular thinking with recycling, disassemblage, cascading. They try to choose materials in a sound way and substitute hazardous and harmful materials, socially harmful. That's when the production systems might involve effects for some people far away, health effects or other effects. They want to strive for dematerialization and defossilization, and then we have the great problem of durability. Then you can say that some schools stress further reduction of consumption, equity in a global context, sufficiency to limit consumption to what is really needed, eco-effectiveness, and imitating nature is part of most of these schools to some extent. And to change system, with changing products, you often have an opportunity to design a new production system. You could perhaps call cradle to cradle the ultimate vision. It's a vision that tries to not only close the loops, but also to create loops that contribute to enhancing the resources in society. And this particular vision, it has been lifted to play a very central role in the concept of circular economy. The circular economy, it's not a sensational concept. It has actually been around quite a while, but nobody has used it, at least not in Europe or the US, or very few. But the last 10 years it has had a remarkable breakthrough and development as a political concept. It started with China. that introduced the circular economy as a development goal 10 years ago, starting with the plan, the 11th five-year plan that was starting in 2007. The concept, you can say, returned to Europe and was launched by a foundation, Elen MacArthur Foundation, and in a global program, the Circular Economy 100. And then it suddenly got interesting in the European context, and the EU Commission started to develop this concept as an important policy goal, and by the end of last year, the EU Action Plan for the Circular Economy was launched. The circular economy, it's not so sensational for those that have been involved with eco-cyclic thinking for a long time, kretsloppstänkande. The central message is that we should change society or the economy from a linear to a circular one. And it should be based on certain principles to preserve and enhance the natural capital, optimize the resource yields, what you get out of a given resource. And the tools for this is most often connected to some sort of circulation, the reuse or recycling. And you need to foster system effectiveness. And you see this vision that is, rather close to the cradle and cradle, but it's perhaps a bit more realistic because at the bottom you open up for waste to energy as the last option. Here I try to provoke a bit, haven't we seen this before? Of course we have, because the circular economy, it's nothing really but a new frame or label that brings together already established schools, so with a common roof. Here I try to investigate the history of the concept from the Linköping University Library databases, Scopus. And as you can see, it's hardly mentioned at all in the scientific literature until in 2005 or so. It's only sporadically. The first use was by Van Dijk and Nijkamp, and then it comes with Pierce and Turner. That's the authors, or were the authors of the most influential book. Textbook in environmental economics, and Paul Akins also mentioned this, but the first time it's used in a heading was actually in China, the Circular Economy and Sustainable Development in Shanghai. And the first time it was used in Sweden was also connected to China, like almost everything until 2012, 13. All the literature is connected to China. 2 or 3 Chinese students at the University College of Kristianstad. And here you see the dominance of China. The takeoff sometime around 2005, and then it seems as the government demands every researcher to write at least a piece on circular economy. It's about all industrial sectors, it's about all regions where different researchers go through what can be done to make the economy more circular. But then you should also understand that circular economy in the Chinese context is not the circular economy that we meet in the European or American context. It's very much connected to the heavy industry, to cleaning up the heavy industry in China, not so much consumption. And that's one of the, well, thrilling encounters I've had with China, because the Chinese I met, they don't understand anything about our waste treatment and how we can get people to sort their waste. It's on the other side of the horizon, involving recycling initiatives on household waste. Personally, I'm not always a fan of new concepts. I think that we should be a bit careful with new concepts, but with a certain distance, I think that a concept like circular economy may bring something new, but it's a kind of surprising that so many think that this is something that is very new.
Just in connection to producer responsibility and so on, that is quite many years now.
Yeah.
There seems to be in this thing that you not only sell something, you have to consider it when it's wasted or going for waste. That you have some kind of responsibility at least.
Yes, and well, you can say that the European continent had as many closing the loops related initiatives as Sweden had in the 90s, but they didn't have the concept. With few exceptions. In German, you actually can talk about the Kreislaufsgesellschaft, but in general, nobody understands in at least American English, what you talk about when you have used eco-cyclic or whatever the Swedish government tried to sell. Those days. What is striking about how EU interprets the circular economy is that it's perhaps less about the conventional waste systems. It's more inspired by the cradle to cradle that has a focus on designing products, and you could say distribution and waste systems, but products first, and industrial symbiosis that has very much to do with designing production systems, so that different industries can exchange resources, and particularly it's based on using each other's waste and byproducts. So it's a bit more industrial focus, and it has a focus on the two upper levels in particular. That's where they bring in, you could say, some fresh stuff by building on some of these recent mimicking nature design schools. Then you can also see that this action plan, it's taking, you could say, a bit of the temperature. What is considered as problems? What is considered as where we haven't come very far? And which are the priorities? Plastics, that's the great bulk material where recycling has been difficult to develop. Some countries in Europe have stored enormous stores with plastics, but they are still accumulating because they can't find users. They can't find ways to sort it in a way that is appropriate for buyers of this waste. Food waste is an area where a lot more can be done. Biogas, it has developed a lot in Sweden, but there are many countries where they don't have any movement in a similar direction. Then raw materials of decisive importance, it's actually coming in from the EU security policy that has noticed that for a large part of the relatively rare minerals, China is the totally dominating producer. What happens if China does not want to sell to Europe anymore? So it's more or less saying that for particular resources we should encourage alternatives. For strategic matters. And then it's construction and demolition waste, where you also have, if you look over Europe, very different levels of development. That was
What's the incentive for a business to go in this direction? I mean, is it like moral, or is it, can they get any profit, or is it just, will it be policy based, or what is the driver?
Well, if I read EU does not expect the business to go in this direction because it's morally right. But they see it as an obligation to create frameworks for industry to make profits out of going out in this direction.
And how is that being done?
That remains to be seen, but it's I think that it will be something like, well, maybe the German way of creating development is too expensive to launch at an EU level, but it will be definitely inspired by some of the German politics. They create system that, not in the Swedish way, are under discussion every year, but potential investors, they know that this system will last at least the next 5 to 10 years. So it's part of the thinking about getting some sort of movement to create relatively stable structures where investors can be encouraged. And if you look at these areas, it's very much about creating new investment, but also to make companies more responsible. So it's about extending the producer responsibility, for example.
But do you think that this will happen naturally through political policies, or do you think it's the public that will demand it?
I think that, in my view, I would say that the EU is the hope, because you can't make the whole of Europe demanding anything like that. I think that there are some nations that are aboard and like the development of such policies, but to really make it into you could say European-wide law, you can't wait for, or if you try to wait for the general public to demand it, then you can wait forever. And that's the way that EU policy has developed. That in some countries they are still not there to demand policies that were introduced in the 80s at the EU level. Then there is also then when you don't have the proper soil for a certain policy, it takes time to implement. So there can be backlashes, but if you look at the development in Europe, it's still very linear. On the left you see the blue is landfilling of municipal waste. If we take the total waste, then it's totally dominating. But you see that it's getting smaller, and what is developing is the recycling. And the European recycling level is percentage-wise as high as it is in Sweden. But Sweden has get more out of waste in terms of energy production. Now, EU want to raise to, you could say, double the recycling from municipal waste until 2030. But for some countries, most countries in Europe, well, at least a few years ago, they landfilled more than half of their municipal waste. So there are, it's an enormous, there are some enormous contrasts. But so it's just what they want to do in the new waste directive in the EU. It's about well, a rather dramatic increase of the recycling when it comes to municipal waste.
How does this correspond to the increasing pressure by the exploding middle class fight?
I don't think that the EU really has thought that in, because the exploding middle class in Europe, it's limited to the poorer countries.
So it's not a European issue?
No, it's not. It's not the European framework.
But globally it's like... the effects of what we do in Europe, where our middle class is not increasing that much globally, what will the effect of this be? And what's the point of having a European discussion when it should be a global discussion?
The point is that in Europe you can do something. Globally you can't introduce policies of this kind.
But on UN level, is there nothing going on there?
In terms of recycling? Yeah, in terms of waste management?
Nothing.
Yeah, of course. But you could say that the UNEP activities or UN habitat activities, they can influence global development, but more like, well, spreading rumors about good examples and technologies, systems, etc. But they can't develop any policy. That's not what UN can. Except you could say very basic statement, declaration of human rights. But UN is not a governance level. EU has legislative powers. So that's why it's appropriate to have a policy discussion on the EU level. EU can, what the EU does matters, and what you see is, as an effect of the EU policy, is definitely the movement between 2001 and 2010, and all the developments in, you could say, the less developed parts of Europe. It's very much stimulated by EU policies. So what is happening, you don't have to go to Bulgaria and Romania, but it's enough to go to well, Eastern or Southern Europe.
Question here.
Yeah.
Incentives in different ways on national levels and so on could be a driver of this. I'm a bit, yeah, I would see that Sweden could have more incentives in that sense. For example, when it comes to solar energy or something like that, or to electrical cars. Why don't we see anything of that coming right now in Sweden? Do we have any?
Yeah, I think that's something that we are struggling with. All that we don't understand, particularly now when you could say the Green Party is in government for the first time. You would at least have expected some clear, well, sign of direction, but instead Sweden seems, well, hesitant.
Yeah.
It's as if we think that we should decide for the future energy solution, and which is the best. It differs at least every year.
Right.
And therefore we get this short-sightedness in Sweden that is certainly not the case if we go to Germany. Of course, Germany has greater muscles, it has a much greater industry to play with, but at least we could have a bit more stable policies. The last 10 years have been, particularly in the car business, it's disastrous for the motivation that people that bought an environmentally friendly car some 5 years ago, now it's not an environmental car anymore.
And energy energy as well.
Then you create insecurity both among consumers and the whole industries that have started to develop. I think that it's of course it's a strange situation today, particularly in the energy field with such a low oil price.
Yeah.
It's extreme,
Yeah.
but still I think that a government should be able to give some sort of direction and stable frames.
It should be even more important
Yeah.
in that sense, because we still know the drawbacks with the
Yeah.
drive.
Yeah.
So because of the low oil price, should be more of a driver to do something else.
Yes, and maybe it's the appropriate timing for many things. Just to try to list some challenges for sustainable design. The basic in a fossil society as ours, Sweden is of course not the worst case. It's that fossil fuels are omnipresent, and then it's an enormous problem to find a good and systematic evaluation of alternative materials and sometimes also life cycles. And then what I will address shortly is that all environmental and resource indicators have limitations and problems. And social impacts, particularly far away, are very difficult to monitor and compare. And then we have the dilemma that often, and perhaps more often than we imagine, technological improvements, increasing efficiency, have rebound effects. That, when products go down in price and go up in performance, we consume more, we use our products more. And, if you don't think enough about what you substitute then substitution of materials may lead to problem shifts. Just some examples of some common measurements for evaluating global trade. The most common are just money flows. The problem with money flows is that it does not show much environmental or resource effect. Mass, more meaningful. Then you can use different energy measurements. Ecology studies, it's a whole field, but there are different kinds of embodied energy, how much energy that is put into producing a particular product. Then, as a development of that, you have embodied CO2. A very popular measurement is ecological footprint, and virtual water has also been an upcoming. But if you just look at the global exchange, you can get fairly different results. The extremely clear result you get when it comes to CO2 exchange. When it comes to CO2, embodied CO2, China is supplying the whole world with CO2. And that is, of course, a consequence of China's industrial strength in consumer products. And that China is among the most fossil intense countries. The whole industry is built on coal. Already by changing coal to gas would be visible in such an calculation. If we instead go to virtual water, North and South America are the great suppliers of embodied water in the world economy, while Europe, as in the CO2, but here Middle East and China are the deficit areas that are supplied with water. If we just look at mass flows, I already addressed this, then you have large countries, large peripheral, traditional industrialized countries, and the oil exporters such as Saudi Arabia, Iran, for example, that supply the world with mass, while great importers are Western Europe or some countries in Western Europe, the US and India. China is a bit undecisive, because China is both a great exporter of materials and an enormous importer, not least of wood products. When it comes to food, it's a similar pattern, that it's large industrial peripheral countries that supply the world with food. And the whole food market, or the global food market, as well as other transfer of food, is totally dominated by the US alone.
Working with food waste research and so on.
Yeah.
There are a number of definitions of those, and there are of course things that we can't use from nothing else, like from bananas and so on. We can't use everything from that and so on. So we have at least eatable food and non-eatable food. But food waste by some are now defined are 3 levels. Lost waste is extra calories.
Yeah.
Okay, food waste are consumed, extra calories are consumed. There might be, I would say, the largest for the economy and so on, the largest challenge for many of these countries as well as China now coming. That we have all the diseases and so on that are brought from overconsumption. That is food waste in a third way. So this is interesting.
Yeah, it's an interesting development, because you have so many trends at the same time.
Yeah.
And particularly in China, where it goes so fast that if you look at waste streams in China, it's very much food. And when you watch TV in China, they get many ideas of how to keep your body in shape and. But of course, these suppliers in a very integrated and connected system, they depend on inputs from other countries. Even if it's the US that is responsible for the majority of the world trade in food, the US needs fossil inputs from the Middle East and many raw materials, not least for animal feeding, involving large parts of the world, or at least major exporters, such as Brazil or India. The ecological footprints, it's a very difficult measure to use for global exchange, because it's normally used only for imports, but it tells only a part of the story. If you use ecological footprint for measuring trade, you could say that most of the exchanges of ecological footprints in the world, they take place between different rich countries. And the really poor countries, they can often get footprints from richer countries. So it's because one problem with the ecological footprint is also that it's to a large extent an abstract carbon footprint. So my conclusion I must raise a certain finger of warning in connection with using such measurements without proper consideration, because none of these simple measures give satisfactory evaluations of the manifold environmental effects of resource consumption. They have all limitations and biases, and how do we evaluate impacts of complex products, and also small volume chemical compounds, where it's only very small concentrations. Does it matter? LCA has been the standard tool, but for dealing with these evaluations, but they are very time and resource consuming, and have large uncertainties, and may also be difficult to interpret if you look at complex products. They work best when you have distinct alternatives. And they do a lot better when you don't have to get into real production systems. So they are much better as some sort of scenario tools, actually, because then if you attack real situations, then you have to spend so much time digging data, and once you are finished with your study, it's already outdated. So, I'm going to finish with just pointing at, summarizing my challenges. Recycling, history shows us that it's not an easy way to go. Historically, recycling has been a very dirty business, and to some extent it is still. I could show you more from the streets of Karachi and other cities in Pakistan, but also Europe. Factories that have been based on on secondary materials have often been very polluting. And the pollution has been more difficult to foresee than when virgin materials have been used.
Waste handling is still known with like southern Italy and things like that.
Oh yeah.
Quite much criminal activities.
That's also another kind of dirty business. But the mafia on both sides of the Atlantic, they have been particularly fond of the waste sector. Then recycling is extremely difficult, particularly advanced recycling in terms of reuse when you have a globalized market and a very centralized production. And one of the great challenges with that we have seen in Europe with the development of waste sorting is that there might not be a market in the vicinity or even in the country for certain segments. Well, the Danes, the Danish waste companies I dealt with some 10, 15 years ago, they often told me that they were happy to have not Sweden close and not too far to Germany, because if they really wanted, they could most often find some buyer. But you couldn't find it in the close surroundings of Copenhagen, perhaps.
I'm just thinking, with all of this collection of data that we're doing nowadays, isn't there any kind of hope that we can use that to develop some kind of tools for evaluation? Because it seems to me that policies can't be created because people seem to be failing at recognizing which solution is actually the better one? Or...
Yeah, I think that we should at least strive for that. I think that it was much more optimistic in the end of the 90s, actually. Then now we should, when LCA started to develop and also these, for example, design tools based on LCA. But I don't think that it has really taken off. That there are, you could say, some sort of standardized database where you can go to that where you have it in a format that you can just put into an analysis. I don't think that we are there yet. Well, maybe in some sectors I would expect it, but and companies need to do it themselves also. Some of that work, it's difficult to come so far as a researcher. We have a project. One of my colleagues in Linköping, together with Toyota. Toyota make industrial trucks in Mjölby, and their whole, you could say, income is based nowadays on renting out trucks. They don't sell any trucks anymore. So they have a strategic opportunity that, well, in the end of the truck's lifetime, or maybe earlier, they have to take back the trucks. How can they handle such a system? Because they haven't had this system for so long, and they haven't been really trying to optimize such a system. But in such situations, I think that it should really be an opportunity to make sure that you can, well, you could say, you don't have to start the production all over for all trucks. you could find ways to modernize them in various ways and find them so that they get sufficiently useful for the next generation of customers or the same customers.
Do you see that kind of service rather than a selling product is going to grow that field?
Yes. I think that in connection with the industry it will definitely grow. But then it can look very different in different sectors. So I think the industrial trucks is an extreme case where while you don't really see the same everywhere. You don't rent things that are going to be used in a factory. You don't rent the turbines to a power plant. So it's different how different things develop. But when you sell to industry, I think that's going to increase with renting and product service development. Then we will see if we ordinary customers will also go into that, what extent.
We are seeing to some extent that today that availability as such, take music for example, or TV movies, and so on, but if a movie is available for us to watch whenever we want to, we don't have to buy it as such. Music, CDs and all of that, if you can just download it or use it when I want to, or stream it when I want to. So consumers might be in a, I would say, change of, we don't have to own everything as such. We can also use things. Still we can keep them as available. So I would see that there are more of those things coming. That could be interesting.
I can give an example. We did a project in Linköping last year. They're a company that worked like this, that they rent out the service and the tools to the companies. And when we asked them what about the environmental stuff, and they said, well, our biggest impact is that our stuff is so heavy duty that to produce them takes a lot of energy. But they say because we treat the tools and we have a caring system, we kind of gain it back by not using as much, which I think is quite interesting.
Yes, it's interesting, but I think that there is a lot of developments ongoing that don't think about improving the, you could say, eco-performance. So there is probably a large untapped potential as this develops. Yes, and well, there was this about data collection. It's still, I didn't emphasize that, but it's one of EU's priority areas. Also, you could say recognizing that we have not come as far as we thought that we would. It's particularly stressing the need of monitoring system developments, so we can know more about how things are handled in different parts of Europe, and waste tracking. Because every country is probably trying, but we don't have a very good overview, and just by going to this Pakistan example, you are fascinated that the products that you see there, it's from well-known companies that in perhaps 15 to 20 years have boasted about their ethics, and that they have perfect control of everything. And I thought, for example, Dell was such a company, but still there are Dell computers in Pakistan.
But this law that they made now, that you will be able to hand in all your e-waste to the stores that sell electronics, do you think that's going to change things? That the, how should I say, distribution will realize that they're getting stuff back?
Yeah, I actually thought that you had more or less that opportunity in many stores, but maybe it's I thought that I hadn't used it enough. I have only sent back things to Dell.
And now I think it's the law that they either passed or are going to pass is that you could take back any article to any store pretty much, which is then quite.
Yeah.
So if I buy this computer at another store, I could take it into Clas Ohlson no matter what because they sell equipment and stuff.
Yeah. Oh, that's. I think that's part of this. The next step of extended responsibility, not only for producers but also for middlemen. So something else. I also think that something that will be of greater interest is also, first we need to develop bio alternatives, but then it will also be a challenge to evaluate how we best use biological materials, because that's an area where we will soon have some use conflicts.
I just came across another concept as the bioeconomy.
Yeah.
What's the difference between that and the
Bioeconomy, it starts, it's basically that we replace the fossil by a bioeconomy. But the central concept in the bioeconomy, that's to, you could say, replace the fossil-based chemical production with biorefineries. And biorefineries will make sure that you get the most out of biological resources. So first you produce all chemicals that you can, and then the rest might end up as energy production. And it's you could say that it's stimulated both in the continent in France and Germany, but not least in Finland, where they hope that will be the next generation of forest industry.
Isn't there like biodiversity also involved in that we see that we are homogenizing a lot of species and so on, and that will be a natural way to take out whole ecosystems and so on by limiting diversity, because we are producing fish more than only fishing. In that sense, we're losing a lot of biodiversity in that time. I don't know if that's included, but it's been recognized as a huge problem.
I think that it's in the discussion.
Okay.
But then it's then you also have all these ideas of, you could say, replacing more production in nature with more artificial. creating, well, something like greenhouses for producing fish and seafood and so forth. Yes, and then you have the whole insect idea also. So, the bioeconomy discussion has really taken off. I still don't know how it connects to the circular economy, because that's a new favorite concept in Europe. But it's definitely connected. Yeah.
It's my task to thank you for coming here, and I had to also advertise Anderberg a little bit, which is a local organic shop.
Oh,
many packages business there. Here's a button knife made out of old wood, which you can recycle by putting it back to nature. If you want.
But first I intend to use it.
I will use it for
Thank you.